suppose you don't know how panic-stricken I am every time I have to proclaim the gospel. I always worry quite desperately whether I would remember my points or not. So I have my notes handy just in case. I saw something very disturbing on Facebook the other day. It rattled me to the nth degree. It ruined not only my entire day, but my entire week. For I just couldn't believe it. The shock, the horror, when I saw one of my friends, well, I unfriended them after this whole business. After one of my friends took the risk of posting on Facebook that it's only 100 days to Christmas. I was completely and utterly devastated. I don't know about you, but I'm not yet in the mood for Boney M's casual Christmas carols. I have an aversion to their version of White Christmas. I just feel like running a mile whenever I hear that in Checkers or in Clicks. I can't get over the fact that December is around the corner and this year is now 3/4 done and dusted. When we started 2024, we knew, you and I both knew, that there would be no guarantees. I remember very clearly where I was on New Year's Eve. You have to forgive me, I was at the Baxter for a Mark Lottering show. And as I stood there with the balloons coming down from the roof, I could not predict at all what this year would hold. I suppose, like in any other years, I could safely expect good and bad, joys and sorrows, some mountaintop experiences, but also dark and gloomy valleys. We never get too far with foretelling what would happen to us over a 12-month period that would and could follow. I suppose that the fact that we are here today is a positive sign because it means that we have at least survived, however poorly, some by hook or by crook. But here you are to tell the tale. Having survived and having once again experiencing God's goodness and grace. Even now, as some people start to prepare for Christmas, no one can make the extravagant claim that they can foretell the future, that they can own any sort of guarantee for themselves. There might even be some of us, dare I say, who might not be around in 3 months' time. Life is uncertain and unpredictable at any given time. But this morning, I don't want to talk about the uncertainty and the unpredictability of life. You know what I want to talk about? I want to talk about something which is absolutely certain. Something which is absolutely rock solid. Something which is never unstable, something which never ever wavers, and that is the faithfulness of God. In 2001, I had to do a trial service. I said to you that I have been doing God's work for a long time. Ministry is all that I've ever wanted to do with my life. And so I started preaching in the year 2000, just as the new millennium was dawning. And 2 years on, I had to do an examination service, a service at which I was assessed in order to enter the next step of training towards the ordained ministry. And of course, the examiners were there, and They did their thing. They were sitting in the seats, trying to hide themselves amongst the other congregations. But they had their sheet in front of them, the sheet that would help them to assess me and my preaching and my prayers, and just how I generally would conduct a service. And Mike, I think one of the examiners looked a little like you. So this is a very daunting thing for me to have you in the third row from the front. Do you have glasses, Mike? So yeah, so that's exactly the look. Just put on those glasses for me, please. And the examiner, I don't think he realized it, but he would every now and then, when a hymn was sung, stare at me from over these glasses. Just give it a shot, Mike. Did you see? Oh, this is so uncanny. This is exactly what that examiner looked like. So you can just imagine how riddled with nerves I was. Of course, I had spent a long, hard time trying to ascertain, trying to discern what I needed to preach for my trial service. It was make or break. I didn't want to preach anything radical or controversial. I also didn't want to try too hard to impress, lest I lose marks on that. So I went with what I thought was a safe bet. Then I soon realized that it wasn't only a safe bet, it was also something very dear and near to my heart. It was then, and it still is now. I wrote a 7-page sermon. I suppose I was always somebody who went overtime in church. I wrote, in those days it wasn't computers, we had to write sermons. I wrote a 7-page sermon on the faithfulness of God. It went down very well in spite of the terrible look of the examiners. No offense, Mike. I think I got through with a B+, which is not too bad, hey? I was a beginner after all. I know that you would probably nowadays all give me an A++, but this is 23 years ago. So I would settle for that, and I would candidate for the ministry, and I would go on to become a full church minister in the Methodist Church. I often think of that sermon. I often think of the importance of what I said back then. For I suppose in so many special ways, that sermon set the foundation for the rest of my life. It was definitely setting the foundation for the ministry which followed. For after that point, there would be many trials and many tribulations, many tests and many temptations, but through it all, God has been faithful. And here I am being able to testify precisely how faithful. You will never hear me preach from the book of Numbers, simply because I'm bored stiff when I read anything from it. It's not the most inspirational book in Scripture. I suppose last week I said to you that I don't like the book of Lamentations. Now we can add Numbers to that list. Okay, the two of them could contend of who would be my least favorite. I mean, Numbers is just too numbery for me, if you know what I'm saying. There are all these records of how many of them got out of Egypt and how many went into this tribe and how many went into that tribe. I don't find that it comforts me in any way. So in my last 24 years of preaching, I don't think I ever went there when I wanted to inspire and edify the people of God. But not so long ago, I stumbled across a verse from there. I shouldn't say stumbled. In fact, it was given to me by a friend. A friend quoted in a conversation words that come, guess what? From the book of Numbers. And I was knocked sideways. I must admit that I didn't realize at the time that the verse came from there. Then perhaps I would have patted her on the back with being so impressed and moved that something good could even come from that book in the Old Testament Torah. Hidden there, like a precious gem, in chapter 23 of the book of Numbers, and if you now have to know, it's verse 19 I'm talking about, it says there the following: God is not a human that he should lie. when she used this in a chat, I thought to myself, I've heard that before. Maybe, just maybe it's from the Bible. And so I jumped onto Google, and there it was. Numbers 23, verse 19. A simple verse, but a loaded verse. A verse which speaks volumes even early on. When was Numbers written? 3,000 years ago? Even then, whoever put pen to paper on that fateful day writing this verse must have known what they were talking about. For that truth was their reality. They had clearly seen, they had clearly tasted, they had clearly experienced that this was God. And this is something that you could definitely put in his CV when the time came. That he's not a human that he should lie. In other words, he's nothing like us. So we scheme and connive, we lie and play games, and we succumb to the weaknesses of being human, but not God. God is totally different from us, in a category of his very own. Often at college, as I was studying theology, we would speak of God not as God, because it's a word that has been so used and abused incorrectly. We often spoke of God as the other, with a capital L. Emphasizing that God is so much the other that we cannot understand him. We cannot make sense of his mystical being. He is nothing like us. And one of his sure attributes has always been his faithfulness. People in the times of the Bible, whether they lived before Numbers was written or not, all experienced the same thing. They all had the same story to tell. Even guys like Noah, who lived back in the day in Genesis chapter 6, when he heard this voice from heaven saying, Noah, you know what? I want to establish a covenant with you. He must have gone looking up at the sky saying, huh? You see, it wasn't raining when God told Noah to build the ark. And so this was, I suppose, a bit of a chance that Noah had to take. Will I obey or will I not obey? Is the God who's speaking to me with such a convincing voice, is he faithful? Can I actually believe what he says? It's recorded in the book of Genesis that society derided Noah, that they teased him, that they mocked him as somebody who was stupid, as somebody who had lost his marbles. But then soon enough, the first drops started falling. And everybody who had been so nasty to Noah had to shut up, for God was there, proving to be faithful. If you ever have an opportunity to have coffee with guys like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they'll tell you the same thing. Of how this God who had placed on them a particular calling at a particular time proved to be faithful always. When people let them down, God didn't. When they let themselves down, they knew that God never would. One of the most classic examples that stand out in the Old Testament regarding the faithfulness of God has to be Moses. This poor chap didn't have much of a choice after the burning bush episode, Exodus 3. You know, God spoke to him so profoundly that he had to say with a trembling voice, "Yes, okay, I'll do it." The rest, I want to say, is history. But is it? Not when it comes to the faithfulness of God. So Moses gets them out of Egypt. Okay, Exodus chapter 14. And in Exodus chapter 15, Moses even writes an exciting song saying, "The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation." And so the verses build up. They continue, and they reach a climax of Moses saying to the people, "Sing to the Lord, because he is faithful." The people at that stage weren't persuaded, however, for there was still a long road ahead of them, right? There was still the wilderness wanderings that awaited them. 40 years in a desert is no joke. And so the complaint soon started. God's people were unhappy. And Moses didn't know what to do with himself. For the lamenting raged from morning to night. Remember how they complained about there being no water? And then when they arrived with a place of water, the water apparently was bitter, and then they bitched about that. And then they found other things to make poor Moses' life really, really, really difficult. They were just on another level of complaining and being unhappy. Some of them even, you're going to probably fall off your chair when you hear this, some of them even went as far as saying, "We want to go back to Egypt. It was better for us there." Every time we have it written, however, that Moses called upon the name of the Lord. Every time we have it that Moses sought the face of God, God came through for him, God delivered the goods, and Moses knew in his heart of hearts that God is exactly who he said he was in the first place, and this God in whom he had dared to put his trust was utterly trustworthy. And I want to guess that that could very well be what kept Moses going all those years. The fact that he knew deep inside of him that God is faithful. And that God would produce. And that his trust in God was not misplaced. Have you heard the name Gideon? Yes. One of the judges. There was a period of judges about 1,200 years before Christ walked on earth. They tried their best to not have anarchy prevail. They tried to maintain law and order, sometimes not being successful at all. But God raised Gideon up as one of the 13 judges to keep an eye over his people. Gideon has a personal track record of having come eyeball to eyeball with the faithfulness of God. For in Judges chapter 6, we have one of the funniest tales. It's where Gideon tries to strike a deal with God, clearing his voice and saying to God, "You know what? This is how it's going to work. You need to do something for God, for me." And God must have said, "Okay, let me have it." So Gideon said, "I need a sign. That's what I'm demanding. Give me a sign, and then I'll be yours. I'll be yours 24/7. So Gideon said, "Here's how this is going to work." I mean, the audacity of instructing God. Gideon said, "I'm going to put a fleece outside my bedroom window, on the ground, on the grass, whatever. And you need to affirm what I'm wanting to do. If I wake up tomorrow morning and the fleece is wet of the morning dew, and the ground around it is not wet, I will see that as your heavenly sign. Thank you very much." I still cannot come to terms that God did what what Gideon wanted. When his alarm went off the next morning and he peeped through his bedroom window, guess what he saw? Only the fleece was wet with the morning dew and the ground around it was dry. Now if God could do that, God can do anything. He's truly a miracle working God, a God who is professional in the impossible. That sign wasn't sufficient for dear Gideon, however. He wanted more. He required more. So we went back to God saying, you know what, this is lekker, but we're going to have to do this one more time. I want to be 100% sure that you are with me. And so we're going to do it the other way around now, God. I trust that you're going to be up to it. Please turn it around the next morning. Let the fleece be dry and the ground around it be wet with the morning dew. You're going to fill in the gaps for the rest of the story now, aren't you? That's exactly what happened. God proving to even Gideon, of all people, that he is who he says he was. And that there is nothing that he wouldn't do for his people. Even in the obscure book of Judges, the faithfulness of God shines through like a bright light. I need to stress God's faithfulness in David's life. You don't have to look so stressed. This morning's sermon doesn't have 3 points, so it's like you're now waiting for me to go to the second point and change gear. There's only 1 point, okay? So you can chill. I suppose there is going to be something in it for us if we look at David and God's faithfulness in his life. For if there's somebody that God probably shouldn't have been faithful to, it's probably David. David was a mess. He was a broken man, a sinful man, a lustful man. And there was lots of blood in his hands because he was a warmonger. He was fighting with the neighboring nations all the time, left, right, and center, like somebody who was obsessed with killing. Yet somewhere along the line, there was this amazing shift even in David's life. Even when he stooped to a new low of watching Bathsheba have a bath. I always think it's the strangest thing that the word bath actually appears in her name. She was taking a bath on her rooftop. Of course, David got his binocs out to have a good look, not wanting to miss any of the action. And then, of course, he went over into action. And then, as if that was not enough, for good measure, he even had her husband, her innocent husband, killed by placing him in the front line of the next battle. Do you understand what a broken human being King David was? And yet God does this insane thing of calling somebody like that a man after his own heart. And I've been trying to study into that over the last week because I can't believe that God could reconcile himself with adultery and with murder. And then I found the pearl, which is Psalm 51. And there we read in great detail David's psalm of repentance and confession. David having come to the rude awakening that God was very holy and that he was so not very holy. And that he needed the mercy, God's cleansing power, God's saving touch. And that is why God could later make the proud declaration, a man after my own heart. Later in the Psalms that are always our favorites, David would refer to the faithfulness of God over and over and over again. For he hadn't only read about God's mercy from books by the saints. No, God's mercy had been active in his life in a world-altering way. And that is why we have Psalms like Psalm 57, where David exclaims, "Be exalted, O God, for your love reaches the skies, your faithfulness rises to the heavens." For David, it wasn't a game any longer, for he had come face to face with the enduring faithfulness of God. The story of the Old Testament and God's faithfulness reaches an absolute climax in Jesus. If you don't fall for anything that I have said thus far, I hope that what I'm saying now will wrap itself around your heart. The story that Jesus is walking, talking evidence of God's faithfulness. It's like God's faithfulness was crammed into a human body of flesh and blood. Because for centuries, the prophets of the Old Testament had been saying, watch this space. Look out for Messiah. God Almighty will be sending his Christ. And so, on a starry, starry night, God once again lived up to that expectation. When only a few noticed, in a forgotten village called Bethlehem, God fulfilled that promise, once again showing for all willing to see that he is who he says he is, that he can be trusted because he is faithful. Jesus is the tangible, the visible, the audible proof that God is no liar. He said he would send Messiah, and he did. And he said he would carry you, and he does. This coming Thursday, I'm celebrating 14 years since my ordination. It was quite a hectic event. It was held in East London. There were 54 of us being ordained in front of a congregation of 5,000. There's not a Methodist church in East London that can host that many people, so the church had to rent a warehouse. And of course, the presiding bishop was there, and the other bishops were there, and my family had traveled in a combi all the way from Cape Town. It was this big event, okay? The church had tried its best to turn the warehouse into some kind of worship building. There was a bit of a make-believe altar and so on. And it was not only an exciting experience for me, it was also a nerve-wracking experience. Standing there in front of all the big shots of the church, laying down my vows once and for all, vows that cannot be retracted, so by the way. They can't be retraced. Ordinations for life. So there I stood, having to make these promises, and I would swear that I would be faithful to God for as long as I lived. I was dedicating my life to this cause. But I wouldn't have been able to come through that panic-stricken moment if I was not holding on to that not only am I going to be trying to be faithful to God, I know that on this journey of ministry, God would be faithful to me, because that is what He told me. And so over the last 14 years, I would be a traitor if I stand in front of you today saying that God hasn't been faithful to me. For God has been faithful to me in every step that I have taken. The beautiful thing about God's faithfulness is that it doesn't depend on our faithfulness, which is just as well, eh? Is that a sigh of relief I'm hearing coming from the seats? Imagine that. Imagine God's faithfulness was only up for grabs if we got it right being faithful to Him. It wouldn't work, because who is completely 100% faithful to God? It's impossible. Just like you cannot fight a sumo wrestler with a pillow, just like you cannot swim the Pacific from the western side to the south, to the eastern side, so you cannot be faithful to God, because in our human brokenness we have very real issues with disobedience. But today, the words that I have available to me cannot tell you how grateful I am, how awestruck I am that God has remained faithful to me no matter what. Sometimes, especially in those times when I have been unfaithful to Him. That is who He is. His faithfulness cannot be sullied. It cannot be tainted by our unfaithfulness. It was Charles Spurgeon, the great British preacher of the Baptist Church, who said the following: "You would sooner be able to empty the sea of water. You would sooner be able to remove light from the sun. You would sooner be able to make space between two objects more narrow before you can alter the faithfulness of God." Quote and unquote. And so today, I suppose I do want us to do three things. 3 points after all. I want you to take a little bit of time towards the end of the sermon. I'm going to give you a bit of silence. I want you to reflect briefly. I want you to reflect on God's faithfulness in your life. And secondly, I would like you, us, myself included, I would like us to confess, to say sorry to God that there have been very real stages in our lives where we doubted His faithfulness. I want us to apologize to Him for that. And thirdly, I want us to commit ourselves to trusting in His faithfulness for whatever the future may bring. Can you do that? In 2 Timothy, is it 1 now? 2? 2 Timothy 1 verse 30. 2 Timothy 2 verse 30. Okay, it's one of the above mentioned, because now we can move, okay? 2 Timothy 1 or 2 verse 13, as it were, Paul writes to the younger man who he was hoping would take over from him. It looks like 2 Timothy was written towards the end of Paul's life. There are even suggestions that say that he was at this time again in a Roman prison. So his situation was unpleasant and unfavorable. He was old and weary. He must have been darn fearful at that stage, knowing that persecution would be around the corner. A martyrdom of sorts. He still writes, even as late as that, to Timothy. Timothy, you need to always remember that God cannot deny himself, that he who has called you is faithful. And I offer this to you this morning, to grow your confidence and to rekindle your courage. Later in that same letter, Paul relates some of the stuff that he had been through in his life. And then he adds, still to Timothy, through it all, the Lord stood by me and gave me strength. Oh, I remember the chapter, 2 Timothy 4, verse 17. The Lord stood by me and gave me strength. In about 30 seconds, I'm going to shut up. And I'm going to allow a little bit of silence. And I want you to do 3 things for me. Firstly, I want you to reflect on God's goodness and faithfulness to you. And I want you to thank him from the bottom of your heart for it. And secondly, I want you to confess those times in your life where you didn't believe that God would come through for you. And I want you to just take a second or two to commit yourself to trusting God's matchless faithfulness for whatever tomorrow may throw at you. Did you enjoy my sermon from the book of Numbers? Numbers 23 verse 19. Did you enjoy it? God is not a human that he should lie. In that same verse it says, what he promises he will fulfill. What he proclaims he will do. Just so that you know.